All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know we still have a couple folks that are starting to come in, but we want to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to tonight's program. I think you're going to be in store for a really exciting program and a great conversation this evening. This is the continuance of our Long History of Race Relations series. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director at Florida Humanities Council. I'm going to be introducing tonight's program, and I'm going to turn it over to the moderator for tonight's discussion, Dr. Hobbs. In 2020, Florida Humanities launched this series in response to George Floyd's murder in May of that year. The intent was to develop a broader public understanding of Black history in Florida, knowing that while each state has distinct characteristics to its history, the undercurrents tend to be universal. These programs were created with the vital assistance of Dr. David Jackson, the Associate Provost for Graduate Education and Dean of the Graduate College at Florida A&M University, and Steve Seibert, Executive Director Emeritus at Florida Humanities. Over 900 people joined us for the first 4 programs that comprised that part of the series. Tonight, we continue the conversation. Faith and Fortitude, Stories of Black Women in Florida is a 3-part series that emphasizes the experiences of Black women in Florida. We can think of no better way to celebrate Women's History Month than by starting off with these topics. And again, I'm going to introduce the moderator for tonight's program in just a moment, but first I want to cover a few housekeeping items. You can participate in tonight's presentation by entering your questions with the Q&A function of Zoom. And we're going to try our best to integrate as many questions as we can into the conversation. It's also important to remember that conversations on race and history can invoke passion. Our goal is to create an opportunity for dialogue that is honest and respectful. Florida Humanities does not necessarily endorse the opinions of panelists or of audience members. We had 2 additional programs that comprise this series: Faith and Folklore, Sites and Black Women's Stories in the 20th Century, and Refusing to be Silenced, it's Faith and Folklore, Sites and Black Women's Stories in the 20th Century. And we had a second program that focused on Central Florida. Tonight's program is Refusing to be Silenced, the Political History and Future of Black Women in Florida. We have the recordings available for those programs on our website, which you can get to by going to floridahumanities.org. You can also go to floridahumanities.org/events to see additional programs that we have coming up over the coming months. At the end of tonight's presentation, you will receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would greatly appreciate it if you took a moment to fill it out for us. Let us know what you enjoyed, ways that we can improve, and additional programs that you might like to see in the future. And your support, by the way, is essential for helping to sustain these programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we ask that you consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to our organization. Your contributions are vital to making programs like these possible. Finally, I want to introduce the moderator for tonight's program. Dr. Tamika Hobbs is an Associate Provost and Associate Professor of History at Florida Memorial University, the only historically Black university in South Florida. She's the author of Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida, and is a member of the Florida Humanities Speaker Directorate. And with that, I now turn the program over to you, Dr. Hobbs.
All right, thank you very much, Keith, for everything that you've done to facilitate this series. I'm incredibly grateful to you, to Steve Seibert, the Florida Humanities, for having the vision of bringing this program to the citizens of the state and whoever else may benefit from watching this engagement. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Tamika Hobbs, and I am thrilled to have been the moderator for the past 2 sessions of this second installment of the Long History of Race Relations in Florida panel discussion series. And I'm really excited about our guest tonight and the territory that we are going to cover. I had the privilege of working with or being one of the panelists for the first installment that took place last fall. Shout out to Dr. David Jackson at Florida A&M and his vision for creating this. And it was incredibly impactful. And I will have to say that the segments that we have had as a part of this second installment have been just as impactful. We, of course, are in the midst of Women's History Month. And in approaching the subject matter, I was absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to uplift the stories and experiences of Black women here in the Sunshine State. And so really glad to continue this work. Since we got started a week ago today, we've actually heard a number of stories from scholars and experts and storytellers. Our first program, Genesis, took us through sites and stories in the oldest part of our state. Of course, we were talking about the northern and central and eastern and western parts of the state of Florida. We heard about stories like that of Giamara of Biafra, the first Black woman of record whose name is recorded in history, from Tiniati Broughton in Pensacola, going to the opposite side of the state with Adonica Toller. We heard stories about Anna Jack Kingsley and the Kingsley Plantation and her complicated life as a woman who was sold into bondage, but also ended up by the end of her life as owning other people. From Althemise Barnes in Tallahassee, we heard about women like Debbie Edwards and Sarah Hill, who helped to keep the flame of those emancipation celebrations alive for generations in that region of the state. We heard about Eartha M.M. White of Jacksonville, again from Adonica, and all of the wonderful philanthropic and philanthropic work and entrepreneurship that she launched in Jacksonville. And so it was a wonderful start to our conversations. The next segment, the second program entitled Faith and Folklore, moved us forward not only in terms of geography, focusing more on Central Florida, but also moved us more into the 20th century. We heard Ashley Robertson of University of Florida talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and her legacy. We had the pleasure of hosting Julian Chambliss, who talked about Zora Neale Hurston as an Afrofuturist, which was absolutely engaging. And we were able, through Amina Shakir, to uplift, perhaps for many, a little known story of the legacy of Sybil Mobley, the founder of the School of Business and Industry at Florida A&M University. Tonight's program is actually most closely associated with the national theme for Women's History Month, which is Valiant Women of the Vote, Refusing to be Silent. We did a remix on that title for tonight's program, and we are using the second part, Refusing to be Silenced, but we are going to be lifting up the political history and future of Black women in Florida. And so I'm really, really excited for this discussion, and I'm so grateful to our panelists who have agreed to be with us this evening. I will introduce them to you now, and I'm going to start with Sharon Wright Austin. Sharon is a professor of political science at the University of Florida. Her research focuses on African-American women's political behavior, African-American mayoral elections, rural African-American political activism, and African-American political behavior. She is the author of Race, Power, and Political Emergence in Memphis, The Transformation of Plantation Politics in the Mississippi Delta, Black Politics, Concentrated Poverty and Social Capital in the Mississippi Delta, and the Caribbeanization of Black Politics, Race, Group Consciousness, and Political Participation in America. She has also published several articles and books chapters and is on the editorial team for the the American Political Science Review. She is currently editing a book, I love the working title, Political Black Girl Magic, the Elections and Governance of Black Female Mayors, that is under contract with Temple University Press. Our next speaker is none other than Francesca Menez. She is the founder and chief community engager of Community Strategies, LLC. Francesca is a political educator, policy strategist, television host, and entrepreneur committed to creating spaces to educate, inform, and engage people on the issues that are important in their daily lives, helping them to understand that the personal is political. She has appeared on and has been quoted in many national and Florida-based media outlets and publications, including HLN, CNN, in Espanol, USA Today, Politico, the New York Times, the Miami New Times, and the Miami Herald, as well as PolitiFact, PolitiFact Florida. Ooh, mouthful. She is the co-founder and board chair for the Black Collective and serves in the Miami-Dade County Northwest 79th Street Corridor Community Redevelopment Agency. Francesca graduated from Florida International University, earning a BA in Political Science and Women's Studies with a minor in philosophy and a certificate in National Security Studies, and her master's in Public Administration with a certificate in Community Development. Francesca is a first generation Haitian Dominican American and was raised in Miami's Little Haiti community. And our last guest tonight, the last person that I'll introduce, but the first person who will present is none other than Paul Ortiz. Dr. Ortiz is a PEN Award winning author. He serves as a consultant and featured narrator for the PBS series from Henry Louis Gates Jr. entitled The Black Church. This is our story, this is our song. Many of you might have caught that just a few weeks ago. He is also the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and professor of history at the University of Florida. His most recent book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, was identified by Bustle as one of, quote, 10 books about race to read instead of asking a person of color to explain things for you. Fortune magazine listed it as one of the, quote, 10 books on American history that actually reflects the United States. And he is also the author of one of perhaps my favorite books on Florida history dealing with African Americans, and that is Emancipation Portrayed, the Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920. And so I want to welcome again our panelists and thank them for being here. And we're going to kind of continue with the chronological theme tonight. And that, of course, is going to take us to Paul, who is going to talk to us about Black women and their political activity in the early 20th century. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Tamika. It's such an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. I feel very humbled and honored to be with such dear colleagues. And also thank you so much to Keith and the staff of the Florida Humanities for keeping these important discussions moving on, virtually. It's just really exciting. So I want to do something a bit unusual tonight, and that is not start from the beginning, but actually start from the more recent period of history and kind of move backwards in time to Reconstruction. And I just wanted to start us up by talking and thinking about two remarkable African-American organizers of more recent decades. And the people I'm thinking of right now are Patricia Stevens Dew and Laura Dixie. And some of you are familiar with these two remarkable African-American women. Patricia Stevens Dew, of course, was a national leader of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. She was also a local organizer with CORE in the Panhandle during the really rough years of the early 1960s. She organized a number of direct action activities in Tallahassee, including sit-ins, boycotts, strikes. She actually was forced to leave Florida A&M University for a while because of her political activism. She was a person who dared, and she was this incredibly heroic organizer who people were just really attracted to because of her courage and the way, and I've talked to a lot of individuals through the oral history program. We've interviewed so many people who worked with Patricia Stevens Dew. And the qualities that they talk about just admiring of her are the same types of qualities that African-American women during these earlier eras, during Reconstruction, during the Gilded Age, during the Progressive era, during the Great Depression, these are the same types of qualities. And there's really three. And I'll use these qualities to link Patricia Stevens Dew, who, as you know, many of you know, worked primarily in the Panhandle, Quincy, Florida, Tallahassee, but then midlife shifts her range of action to South Florida and becomes very active in the labor movement, helps African-American workers of color organize unions, along with her beloved husband, John Dew, who's also an amazing civil rights figure in and of himself. And but an individual who I know they loved and just really were very close to was Mrs. Laura Dixie. Now, Laura Dixie was from an earlier generation, slightly older than Patricia Stevens Dew. Mrs. Dixie was a founding organizer of the Intercivic Council, which, if you know anything about civil rights history, she was one of the founding organizers of the Tallahassee bus boycott of 1956. She was proudly a working class woman. She was a union organizer. Mrs. Dixie also organized she was really the founding organizer of the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. I said it, AFSCME. Okay, if we have any AFSCME sisters and brothers out there, Laura Dixie was the founding AFSCME president of the Chattahoochee Hospital local. And because of her courage and determination to fight racism and white supremacy, and to get better wages and working conditions for her sisters and brothers on the job, Laura Dixie for many years had to go to work armed. She actually had to arm herself because white coworkers and bosses especially were out to get her, and her life was very often threatened. I first interviewed Mrs. Laura Dixie actually in the summer of 1994 when I was a graduate student at Duke University. I was part of a team that came down to Tallahassee to work under the direction of Professor James Eaton, the founding director of the Black Archives at Florida A&M. It was an incredible experience. And so obviously we interviewing Mrs. Laura Dixie was like stop number one, right? She was an icon. She was a beloved figure. Her and her husband, Sam Dixie, who was a custodian. She was a nurse's aide. Sam Dixie was a custodian. And they were entrusted to protect Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Whenever Dr. King came to Tallahassee in the late 50s, early 60s, especially he was in Florida during the Tallahassee bus boycott, obviously, he stayed with Mrs. and Mr. Dixie because they could protect him. They were, in other words, they were armed. They carried weapons, and they were in a Black working class community that was very well maintained to protect Dr. King's life. At one point, when I first interviewed Mrs. Dixie, I actually wanted to I was so taken by her story in the Tallahassee bus boycott and organizing these unions in the 50s and 60s. I thought, I want to do a civil rights movement story about the 50s and 60s. Instead, I wrote a book that Tamika talked about earlier, Emancipation Betrayed. And the reason I wrote that book about an earlier period of history was women's stories, women's narrative, because the first thing that Mrs. Dixie and her fellow ICC organizers of the boycott, all African-American working class women and men. So these were primarily people who worked as laundry workers, custodians, groundskeepers, domestic servants, you name it. They were the backbone of the civil rights movement in Tallahassee. And when Mrs. Dixie passed away, and I had the great honor of being one of the people that helped deliver a memorial, she was, by acclamation, Laura Dixie was declared to be the mother of the movement in Tallahassee. And it's a great reminder about the importance of working class history. Most African-American women during the time period that we're talking about were working class people. They worked for white folks. They worked in, today at the University of Florida. Again, they're groundskeepers or custodians, they're nurses assistants, they're drivers, they're letter carriers, right? And so, but their strategic position in the economy and their insights and their understanding of how the economy works and how politics and how power works, and they're not under any illusions whatsoever. That is a strength, and it gives us a sense of why Mrs. Dixie told me the next thing she told me, which pushed me away from looking at the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, and instead got me looking at the 1860s. What Mrs. Dixie said was, Paul, you should have talked, you're interested in politics. I wish you'd have talked to my mother. I wish you'd have talked to my grandmother. Those were the women. Those were the activists who were really courageous. Those were the organizers. And all we tried to do in the 50s and 60s was try to live up to their example. So that led me to write the book Emancipation Betrayed. And if you've had the opportunity to read the book, it finishes with this historic statewide African-American voter registration campaign that spans the entire state. African-American organizers in Pensacola, and Gaston County, and these small cities that some of them don't exist anymore, right? Some of you can't find on the map, but the bigger ones too, Jacksonville, Pensacola, Miami, Gainesville, Orlando, Ocoee. And African-American women, again, are the foundation of this statewide civil rights, voting rights movement. And so the question is why? And I think the answer gets back to these qualities that Patricia Stevens Dew and Laura Dixie taught us in these later decades. If you were African-American, or if you were trying to get African-Americans active politically in this state, in Florida in 1920, you're asking people to risk their lives. It's not like today when you go, when we go down to the park or the fair or the church and say, hey, we got clipboards, we need you to sign up, souls to the polls, right? We've all done that. In 1920, if you ask an African-American person to put their name on a piece of paper that says, I'm going to vote, you're asking them to risk their lives. At the minimum, you're asking them to risk their livelihoods. You're asking them to risk their homes if they own a home. They will be attacked. There's no doubt about it. It's coming. So how do you get people moving under such conditions of stress and terror? You have to have really three things as an organizer. You have to model the qualities of mutual aid. And this, I think, was the secret to the success of people like Patricia Stevens Dew and Laura Dixie in later generations. What I mean by mutual aid is whenever I'm in peril, whenever I'm in jeopardy, you come to my assistance. You have my back. I have your back. Not metaphorically, right? But in reality. And so African-American women organized mutual aid societies. And one of the mutual aid societies that they organized was called the Courts of Calantha. It is still around. It is the sister society of the Knights of Pythians. And in those secret societies, those mutual aid organizations, for example, in rural Gaston County or rural Orange County, that I actually interviewed women who were in these organizations before the Great Depression. When you were in the Courts of Calantha, and if you were a tenant farmer and your mule was sick and couldn't pull the plow, or you couldn't do whatever you needed the mule to do, your sister or brother in that organization was bound to come and help you and bring their mule to help get you through that workday. If your husband or your wife was incapacitated, the members of your lodge were required to come and not only pay visits, but to help get you through that rough patch, right? And so that's what I mean by mutual aid. And what it meant was that when people like Mary McCloy Bethune or Tamika mentioned Eartha White, they were also deep into this fraternal mutual aid culture. And it meant that when African Americans asked each other to register to vote in 1920, it wasn't just Black people asking Black people. It was Black brothers and sisters asking Black brothers and sisters to risk their lives. And this is why the movement was so powerful. And this is why the movement of white supremacy was so powerful in response to it. We know about the Ocoee Election Day Massacre, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. But the thing I want to point out in 1920, it took the combined power of local, state, and federal officials to crush Black voting in 1920, just as it takes that today, right? And so moving backwards into Reconstruction, one of the things that Laura Dixie's great-great-grandmother would have been, if we could have talked to her directly, and if we could have asked her the question, well, Mrs. Dixie, you don't have the right to vote. Here's election day. I guess you don't have anything to do with that, right? Wrong. African-American communities, even though women did not gain the right to vote during Reconstruction, African-American women insisted that the ballot was not an individual possession. Kind of today we view it as, one person, one vote, right? Or gender terms, one man, one vote. Black communities in Florida, and as far as I've studied Black communities, I don't know of any Black community anywhere in the South in Reconstruction who viewed the franchise as the kind of the bourgeois individual possession, like it's my vote, it's none of your business. No, African-American women did not accept that. And remember back then, you printed out a ballot, printed out, that's obviously, 21st century term. You had a printed ballot and you went into the polling place with that ballot so people knew how you were voting. And African-American women insisted, we have testimony in numerous congressional hearings where African-American women were insisting on seeing what how their men were voting to make sure they voted the right way. And if they voted the wrong way, there were consequences. The other thing that African-American women did was, again, if you were an African-American in the Deep South, like a state like Florida or Mississippi, and you went to go vote in 1870, you go armed. Now, I know this doesn't make, so there's some of our brothers and sisters who are uncomfortable with this, but I'm just kind of telling you how it was. If you were Black and you went to go vote in a town like Gainesville, which had the highest lynching rate, Alachua County, in the state, which had the highest lynching rate in the country, you went armed. But when the men went in to actually physically vote, it was women who picked up those arms and either guarded the stacked arms. That's when the long rifles, you'd stack them outside, and the women would guard them or sometimes pick them up and actually carry them and to defend the community in the act of voting. So African-American women were always involved in political and political struggle. Tamika, how much time do I have? I can talk about this all day, by the way, but give me a sense for much longer you want me to.
I probably do need you to wrap, but do you mind if I read something from your book?
Please do.
I think would provide a transition that we need. This comes from the chapter entitled With Babies in Their Arms from Emancipation Betrayed. And it's in the subsection that says Women in the Ballot. And it says, when African-American women became eligible to vote, the Florida voter registration movement gained new life. To say that African-American women played a momentous role in the movement would be an understatement. From the time that 4 Black women in Gainesville registered to vote on September the 1st, 1920, to the day of the election, Black women were the movement. Can you talk about Black women and the threat that they posed and the behavior that they inspired from whites in this state during that election?
Yeah, I think the threat that African-American women posed, Tamika, was that they were asking for concrete gains that would come out of the ballot. It wasn't just like, oh, wow, we just want to vote for the sake of voting. It was, we want equal education for our children. Equal education, not okay education, right? To equalize educational outlays in 1920 would have caused a revolution in this state. African-American women, teachers wanted equal pay for equal work. African-Americans wanted the right to unionize, the right to organize. It was not a right that really existed in Florida. So in other words, they wanted concrete gains, and they talked about those gains as coming out of the ballot. They also wanted white people to recognize the dignity of Black communities. You mentioned one of the earlier presentations about the Decoration Day and Emancipation Day celebrations. Even before a single African-American man, even before a single African-American male soldier left for France in World War I, Mrs. Bethune was saying very clearly, we are not going to send our young men over yet again to fight another one of these nations' wars without concrete gains coming out of that. We'll participate in the war, fine. We'll even raise money for the war. And this is another thing that Black women did, Tamika, that a lot of people forget now. Uncle Sam didn't have enough money to put together an army in 1918. The government had to go to communities. I mean, you and I would have had to pull money out of our pocketbook and give it to the government to help outfit that army. So people like Mrs. Bethune, people like Emma Collier, a Black mutual aid leader in Orlando, Eartha White, who you mentioned, one of the things they did during World War I is organize Black communities to help support the war effort, right? To raise money for the troops, even supplying the troops with food and blankets and medical supplies. And imagine, African-American communities are the most stressed out communities in the entire region because they're kept economically oppressed, and yet they're the ones through women's leadership raising money for the war effort. But again, it comes with, this is the thing Eartha White, Emma Collier, and Mrs. Bethune has said. And the other thing I want to point out is that they're saying it not as individuals, right? They're saying it as part of communities, but also remember, Mrs. Bethune is the president, not only of the Florida Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, she's the president of the Southeastern Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. She's a national leader of that organization. And so these incredible, powerful networks of sisters in solidarity. And so, but they're telling, this is national. This isn't just Florida. Nationally, it's Black women who long before Black men return, like we have this very gendered image of Black male veterans returning from World War I or World War II, demanding the right to vote, right? Demanding citizenship. And there's a truth to that. But the equal truth is that Black women are the ones that before the disembarkation and the deployments happen, it's Black women who connect the dots between service and citizenship.
Thank you so much for bringing that into focus. It definitely complicates, I think, what many people understand about Black women's political activity here in the state of Florida during this period of the early 20th century. So at this point, I'd like to transition and invite in Dr. Sharon Austin, who is a political scientist with focus on African-American women, Black women, and their voting habits. And so, Dr. Austin, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you all for inviting me, and thank you, Paul, for that really awesome presentation. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that I want to share. I hope you all can see that. So I decided there are so many women in Florida who've been active politically. And when I was asked to talk about one of the more contemporary women, I decided to focus on former Congresswoman Carrie Meek. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. All right, so you've already introduced me, but this tells you a little bit about me. I've been teaching at UF since 2001, and I'm a native of Memphis, Tennessee. All right, so if you look at the cover of my last book, if you look at the top right corner, that's Carrie Meek. One of my students is a very gifted artist and sculptor. His name is Nathan Murray, I'm sorry, and he did the cover of the book. He drew that. He mostly does sculptures, but he also does some other artwork as well. So my book looked at 4 cities: New York City, Miami, Chicago, and Boston. So if you look at this picture, this is Adam Clayton Powell, the former congressman, Carrie Meek of Miami, Harold Washington, the first Black mayor of Chicago, and this was a man who ran for unsuccessfully mayor of Boston. His name is Mel Reed, but he was defeated when he ran for mayor. But now Boston is on the verge of having his first Black mayor, who's also his first Black female mayor. Her name is Kim Janey. So that tells you just how much I think of Carrie Meek. When I thought of Miami, I wanted to put her on the cover of my book. So I want to talk a little bit about, you can read this on your own, but just the fact that her activism was shaped by her background and her experiences. She is now 94 years old. She still is active, not so much in politics anymore, but she is still very active, as I'm going to talk about at the end of the presentation. She was born in 1926 in Tallahassee, the youngest of 12 children. She was the youngest child of 2 people who worked as sharecroppers in the era of segregation. She was the grandmother of a woman who was a slave. So as a child, her parents wanted to give her a better life, and so they really wanted her to be involved in a number of different things, including the Girl Scouts. So she was a Girl Scout, but when she, in this racially mixed group of girls, went to deliver brownies at the state capitol, she had to stand on the sidewalk because she was the only Black member of their troop, and the white girls were able to go to deliver the brownies. So that pretty much tells you just one of the injustices that she had to deal with as a child in the era of segregation. So that sort of motivated her, and it shaped her later political activity. So she later earned her bachelor's degrees in biology and physical education at FAMU. She wanted to attend the University of Florida for grad school, but at the time in the 1940s, Florida didn't allow Black students to pursue graduate degrees or any other degree. at the University of Florida. So she had to attend the University of Michigan. And a lot of states, including Florida, had a practice of paying Black students to go to school out of state. So in exchange for you saying that I'll go to school at, for example, Michigan rather than here in Florida, the state government decided to pay for it. So at least she did get a free education. But again, that tells you just how things were in the era of segregation. So she said that according to her, the state government agreed to pay her out-of-state tuition, which I'm sure wasn't cheap. It is now, wasn't then, if I agreed to get out of Dodge, meaning if I agreed to get out of Florida. So she later earned her master's degree in public health and physical education. She began a long career as an educator at Bethune-Cookman, where she taught biology and physical education. She also coached their basketball team. She later worked at FAMU, and then she later worked for over 30 years at Miami-Dade Community College before she decided to run for political office. So in 1978, and keep in mind, this was a time when you still didn't see very many Black women running for office. Black women have always been involved in civil rights, organizing, and political mobilization, but few Black women until recently have actually run for office and been successful in winning. So in 1978, it was still pretty innovative for a Black woman to say that she was going to run for the state legislature. So she defeated 12 candidates. She didn't have very much money. Her son, Kendrick Meek, who later succeeded her in Congress, was a child then, and he helped her with her campaign, and they just used magic markers to make posters, and they just pretty much had a grassroots campaign in which they went door to door canvassing. She was able to win. So from 1979 to 1983, she served in the Florida House of Representatives. She focused on a number of different issues, but especially education because of her career as an educator before she decided to run. So then from 1983 to 1993, she then served in the Florida State Senate, which is, again, something that's very innovative and uncommon because there still have not ever really been very many African Americans in the Florida Senate because it's harder to get elected in the state Senate than it is in a state house. She was the first African American woman ever elected to the state Senate, and she was the first Black state senator in over a century when she won in 1983. And so there she was involved in a number of different things. And in the Senate, you're able to do a lot more in both the state Senate here in Florida and also in the United States Senate. You have a lot more power to do more in the Senate than you do in the House of Representatives. And she was called the conscience of the Florida Senate because she always did things to sort of empower people throughout the state, especially in the district that she represented, but also to always do the right thing, do the moral thing. And so she received quite, I guess, a following as a result of her political career and the respect that she garnered during the time that she served in the legislature. So then she decided to run for Congress. In November of 1992, she, along with Corinne Brown and Alcee Hastings, became one of the 3 African-American lawmakers, the first 3 to get elected from Florida since the mid-1870s. So again, she was constantly breaking down barriers, being the first Black woman or the first African-American or the first woman to do something. And at this time, she was 66 years old. So even when she was running in November 1992, some people questioned whether she was quote unquote too old. And I think that even probably smacked of sexism because I don't think people really question very much if a man is too old. I mean, I may be wrong because some people said with Joe Biden and Donald Trump that they were too old, but that was the excuse that some people said that, oh, I would love to vote for her, has nothing to do with her race or her gender, but she's just too old at the age of 66. But nevertheless, she was elected to Congress in November of 1992. She served there for approximately 10 years. And then in 2002, she decided that she wouldn't seek reelection. Each time she'd been reelected by almost a landslide. And she said that the reason was because at the time she was 76 years old. And she said that she loved being in Congress. She loved working in Congress to empower people. But unfortunately, at the age of 76, she felt that she could no longer make the physical demands or do the things that she needed to do. So she decided to step down. Her son, Kendrick Meek, later ran for the same seat and succeeded her in Congress. So that tells you just a little bit about her political career. She achieved a lot during her time in the Florida legislature and also during her time in Congress. And so this just gives you a brief summary. I know in the interest of time, I want to be as brief as possible, but she focused on education, literacy, jobs, Especially she wanted to empower children to stay in school. And one of the things that I want to say personally about her that I personally admire is that she focused on special needs children, and I have a special needs son. And so she really was in favor of expanding opportunities for people with disabilities during the time that she was in the Florida House, in the Florida legislature, and also during the time that she was in Congress. She was elected shortly after, she was sworn in, at least shortly after Hurricane Andrew. I wasn't living in Florida at the time, but I remember seeing the news coverage of the devastation in South Florida, especially in the Miami area as a result of Hurricane Andrew. And so she was elected to Congress in November of 1992 and sworn in January of 1993. And her community was still just devastated by Hurricane Andrew. So she really wanted to do something to help people to recover their jobs, provide opportunities for people who had lost their businesses, and expand opportunities, especially for people of color, especially African Americans, to open their own businesses. And that was very difficult because, keep in mind, people were in need of a lot of federal aid. And she was asking for that, but she was also asking for expanded opportunities for people of color. She's always been very committed to the rights of Haitian immigrants, because if you know anything about Florida politics or about American politics in general, you know that there's a double standard, and always has been, especially here in Florida, between Haitian and Cuban immigrants. Haitian immigrants have had to overcome a number of barriers in order to be able to immigrate here legally. They were not given the kind of status as refugees, as political refugees, as Cuban and other immigrants. And so that's something that she's always fought against, denying the right of Haitian immigrants to be able to come to this country to gain status as permanent residents and later to gain status as citizens. So she wanted to expand rights for immigrants to be able to come here and to remain in the United States as refugees, both political and also economic refugees. And so you can just read the rest of this on your own. I know this is just a really brief summary. I can go on and on about all the things that she has focused on, but she also believed in working across the table with Republicans. And you know, now you hear so much about gridlock, Democrats and Republicans voting in Congress, falling along partisan lines, but she was someone who was not afraid to reach across the table to work with Republicans, even at times when some people in her community didn't like it and didn't really understand it. But she felt that if it was something that was going to benefit her community and benefit her constituents, if it was a Republican that wanted to work with her, she was willing to work with them for the good of her constituents and the good of her community. This is something that I mentioned in my book, in the chapter on Miami, that I really admire her for this and her role in this lawsuit. Meek is her last name, Carrie Meek versus Metropolitan-Dade County, because for the longest time in Miami, if you think about the diversity there, with, especially with Latinos and with the Cuban community in Miami, for the longest time, it was very, very difficult for African Americans and Latinos to elect people to office. And that was because there were at-large elections in place that made it so that if you ran for example, the city commission, you had to run citywide rather than in one particular district. And so as a result of that, these types of elections always place minority candidates at a disadvantage because they need more money to win, they need more name recognition, and usually, especially if it's a place where there's racially polarized voting, they can't really get the support from white voters. So it always puts minorities at a disadvantage and whites at an advantage. And so that was exactly the case in Miami. So even though African Americans and Latinos, mostly Latinos, constituted approximately 70% of the population by the early 1990s, few of them won elections, especially locally, because of these at-large elections. And so as a result of that, from 1957 to 1992, only 5 African Americans and 2 Hispanics served on the Miami-Dade Commission just during that very, very long period of time. Even though several had run, very few could win. And so she decided to file what's called a class action lawsuit, in which she, along with other plaintiffs who objected to this, filed on behalf of Black and Hispanic citizens who were trying to elect Black and Hispanic citizens to offices in Miami-Dade County. And so as a result, she was able to win a ruling in her favor in this lawsuit in 1992. And as a result, those at-large elections were dismantled and replaced with district elections. And that led to a lot of diversity, not just on the city commission but also just in general in Miami-Dade County. So for the first time, African Americans and Latinos were able to win elections because these at-large elections were no longer in place. And so you could immediately see an impact. There was a 13-member district commission with 3 predominantly Black, 7 predominantly Hispanic, and 3 predominantly white districts. And so as a result, you saw more representation in these Black districts. They were more likely to elect someone who was Black. In these Latino districts, they were more likely to elect someone who was Latino. And then also in the white districts, they were more likely, I guess, to elect someone who was white, but it led to a lot of diversity for the first time that had never been in place before. So she was responsible for that. And a lot of that was based on her experiences growing up with the types of challenges that she had to overcome because of racism. So I want to show you something. This is only about a couple of minutes. I know I'm running out of time, but this was something that led to a debate about what exactly is appropriate for House members to say when debating things on the House floor. At the time in 1995, Newt Gingrich had a book deal and he had gotten a lot of money for it. And so she questioned it and she challenged it in this video. So I want to show you this, and then after that, I'll go ahead and conclude. But I just want to show you that one of the things I want you to focus on is that they decided to cut her microphone. So I hope you can see this.
Did you share, did you select the share sound when you shared your
Oh,
video?
wait. Yeah.
Because if there's sound, we may not be able to hear that.
All right. Thank you.
And you may end up having to come out and then reshare and select to share audio.
All right. So this, let me go back. I always do this in class too. I don't know why. Okay. So let me see. Can you hear it now?
No, you're going to have to stop sharing.
Oh, okay.
And then,
I see.
as you come back in, you have to select the computer audio.
Okay.
And as you reshare.
All right. So
I think that one will be worth the wait. And while we're waiting on that, I was really glad to hear you bring up the court case because I think we still are living through the legacy of that here in Miami-Dade County. And I think, and Francesca can correct me, we may be at a historic high with 4 people of African descent who are now on the county commission after this last round.
Okay, so I hope you can hear it now. If not, I'll just not sure. Can you hear it?
I don't hear anything.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway. Okay. Well, let me just, all right, so I'll just go ahead and conclude, but I can even just make this presentation accessible, or you can just look it up on YouTube on C-SPAN. But she was criticizing Newt Gingrich because at the time they were making a lot of different cuts. They were really impacting poor people, and yet he had signed this really lucrative book deal, and she questioned just the ethics of him doing that. And while she was doing that, they tried to get her to stop, and she continued to speak, so they unplugged her microphone. So again, that just shows just how outspoken she is. So according to the late U.S. Representative John Lewis of Georgia, he referred to her as being a tugboat and said, I never want to be on the side of issues against her, because that shows just the kind of person that she is. She was always a fighter and still is. So after she retired, she still is active in the Carrie Meek Foundation, and this is their website. So I want to go ahead and just stop there and just again say thank you all. I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you. I really appreciate that that closer look at the career and accomplishments of Carrie Meek. Few degrees of separation here. Paul mentioned James Eaton. I had the privilege of working with him as a young undergraduate at Florida A&M, and the building that he helped to establish, which really launched my interest in Black history. The Black Archives is now named for Carrie Meek. She was able to, being that tugboat, she got a state appropriation that allowed for the re-outfitting of that and expansion of that beautiful Carnegie Library into the Meek Eaton Black Archives Southeast Regional Research Center and Museum. And so I always think fondly of her and her contributions on that front. So we're going to pivot. I do want to invite our viewers tonight to do take advantage of the Q&A box, the chat box, to pose any questions that you would like to have answered by our expert panel this evening. But I'm going to bring in now Francesca Menez. As I said at the outset, I'm really excited about her hang out with historians a lot of times that we deal in the past, but so many of the issues that we're wrestling with today, while rooted in the past, we have to really stay focused on what's in front of us. And so she is, in my mind, one of the foremost experts on Black political agency, particularly in the South Florida region. And I'm so glad that she agreed to be with us this evening. And so, Francesca, I'll turn it over to you just to kind of pick up with a titan in the form of Carrie Meek and talk to us about what you see on the political landscape across the state for Black women today.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. Always excited to be in spaces with you. And thank you again, Florida Humanities, for the invitation as well. So I'm just going to kind of dive into where we are in this current moment, particularly the current political landscape. A lot of my work is very centered on really understanding, particularly local government. So I have my community strategies, but my job is that I'm the National Deputy Organizing Director for Local Progress, which is a national progressive network of local elected officials about over 1,048 states. And so when you think about Florida, when you think about this past election cycle in particular, we know that Black women vote at the highest rate of any gender, of any racial subgroup, and ultimately they are the most reliable voters. We saw what the impact was in the state of Georgia in this recent election, but also just again understanding Florida context of we have about 14% of the eligible Black voters. So it's almost about 2 million voters here in the state of Florida as Black voters. And in that, what we saw in this past election cycle was about 57% of the Black women who were registered to vote actually, was very active in turning out for this last election. And this last election cycle was very unique in the sense of, we know the number breakdown. So historically here in the statewide, we've only had one Black woman who has held office, and we know that was Jennifer Carroll, who was the Republican lieutenant governor, who didn't even complete her full term as lieutenant governor. We know currently we have 2 congressional members, Val Demings, who's in the Orange County, Lake Polk area, and Frederica Wilson, who's down here in South Florida. We only have 1 Black woman state senator currently, Audrey Gibson. And we have 13 Black women who are in the Florida House of Representatives right now. A lot of newcomers that came in from this last election cycle, including Marie Woodson, including Michelle Rayner, including Angie Nixon, who came in this past election cycle as well. But what we saw was at the local level, there was this huge wave of people who were running for the first time. And we're still seeing it this year. So because Florida is kind of like that unique state of like municipal elections never stop. They literally start from January to December every single year. It's not like like the federal races or the state races where we have our midterm election cycle. So we know we're waiting that every 2 years. But at the local level, elections are happening every single day. Literally, elections are happening right now. I'm like watching the results that's coming out of Miramar, in Coconut Creek, because we actually have elections happening today, for example. And so when you think about all of the local races that happened this past election cycle, where you saw a lot of Black women breaking the glass ceiling. You saw Nancy Meteor, who is now the first Black woman to serve on the Coral Springs City Commission, and first Haitian American to serve on the Coral Springs City Commission. Her installation was so powerful because she actually had her grandmother read the swearing in Creole. And that was like, she's like, I'm embracing my culture. I'm embracing everything of who I am. And you're going to know who I represent in this community. And this was, again, like Coral Springs, the shift where in the last election cycle, they were able to elect the first Black man. So we're seeing the shift again happening in some of these cities. We saw Linda Gillian, who was the first Haitian American to be elected to the Miami Gardens City Council. We also saw Linda Hill Anderson, who is the first Black person to serve on in the City of Hollywood City Commission. We also have Renee Flowers, who's in Pinellas County, who was the first Black woman to serve on the county commission in Pinellas County. And so there were a lot of glass ceilings that were broken this past election cycle. Michelle Rayner, again, who was the first Black queer woman who was serving in the Florida legislature. And so when you kind of have to go back and take that step back, when we really ask the question of who runs, why they run, I always feel like it's important to kind of root a lot of this in a lot of different questions that we have to ask ourselves. Me, even being a former candidate who ran in 2016 for state representative in a very crowded race, coming in third, and I was like 29 running at the time. We always have to ask the questions of what motivates Black women to run for office, what ultimately discourages us, like what are the deterrents that discourages us from running from office? What is the support that we need, and what is the support that's available for us when we decide to run? Because again, like when we don't have a strong ecosystem, it makes it very difficult, because you're asking people to step up in a role where in many of these positions, you're not being paid to do them. In Miami-Dade County commissioners get paid $6,000 a year. We had it on the ballot so that we could increase their salaries. And there was this whole campaign that was ran by this billionaire, who basically kind of slighted our voters in a way of like, why should we pay our elected officials to run? And it's like, if you want good people in office, if you want people who are going to do the work of the people and don't have to worry about where their next, paycheck is going to come from, or how are they going to feed their children as they try to serve our community, they need a salary. I believe in Broward County, county commissioners get paid $90,000. So neighboring county gets paid $90,000, and Miami-Dade County they get paid $6,000. Even when you think about like our state legislature and like almost $30,000 a year for their salary, plus their expenses for their office space and such. And so when we think about those deterrents of like, I have bills to pay, I have family to take care of. Like we are usually like the breadwinner. We have other responsibilities outside of the home. But also when we think about when Black women win, do we understand how we're supposed to show up as a community, as the people who supported them? Because there's a lot of work that lacks in how we organize around issues, policy issues in particular, and really understanding inside outside strategy, and understanding that this person may actually be your most vocal advocate, but because you don't have direct line of communication, because you're not taking the time to communicate with this person, you're dragging them in public. But you were the ones who asked them to run in the first place, and you literally cut off the relationship once they got elected into office, and they now became the villain when they are the ones who are internally having to fight, probably even their own colleagues, to be able to actually stand for the community, like Carrie Meek, and because only God knows what she had to face within her own community to be able to really push a lot of issues, to be able to bring the resources down home, the negotiations she had to do behind the scenes. And now with social media has amplified how elected officials ultimately get dragged in public, and they're not able to do the work behind the scenes to really shift the conditions of their constituents, and ultimately shift the conditions of their localities and the state and federally. And also, again, it's understanding what is the role that you want to play as an individual, because again, I always feel like it's important to get folks to understand that not everybody is meant to run for office. Not everyone should run for office. There should always be many conversations that you have, not just with yourself, but with your closest friends, with your closest allies. Create a kitchen cabinet to really sit down and understand, like, what is it that you're getting yourself into? But there are many other ways that we can show up and support people. And so what I've also seen is this growth of a network of Black women political operatives. So we're seeing the Black women fundraisers, we're seeing the Black women campaign managers, the Black political campaign firms. We're seeing like this huge ecosystem of like firms who can run your field programs, all of the different components that you need to successfully run a campaign. And so how is it that you best can show up when we talk about the shifting landscape, the shifting political landscape that we have, particularly here in this state? Because we know time and time again, Black women are always going to show up at the polls. That is not a question. And even Dr. Ortiz mentioned, like, you know, the fact that Black women had to make sure when that ballot was printed that their men were voting the way that they were supposed to be voting, that would actually benefit the community. That is, I wish that was something that people were still doing to this day, because we know that, you know, the way our Black men are showing up at the polls are very different from the way that our Black women are showing up at the polls. And there's a huge gap. And again, like when we talk about ideology and prioritization of issues, there's a very big difference between our Black men and our Black women. And so how do we ultimately shape our agenda to be able to shift the material conditions of our communities when we are not in one accord as a Black community, is like a very huge topic that we still have to address here in our communities, particularly here in Black communities, and understanding, again, you know, me being Haitian Dominican American, born and raised in Little Haiti, is that our Black community is not monolithic. And so the issues that you may care about are not the issues that I care about. And when we have to break down local, state, federal, that's also an even deeper conversation that we have to take the time. We have to educate our community to understand who's on what side, and what the spectrum of candidates are and what the spectrum of elected officials are, so that we can understand what accountability looks like. But we've been seeing this, and we've been seeing this shift, and 2020 proved that even more so than anything, of like the number of Black women who are willing to sacrifice, you know, yes, and run, you know, like Angie Nixon, a dear friend of mine who ran in one of the House districts in Duval County. She was pregnant during COVID and hitting the doors, you know, like, and then, you know, she ended up in the general election, and thankfully her, you know, her opponent dropped out of the race, and then she won, so she didn't have to deal with the November election. But that's how much our Black women are willing to sacrifice. Is like, I will waddle out in these streets pregnant, because I know what I am trying to do for my community. I know how I need to show up. And we come very rooted in the history of like civil disobedience and social justice organizing, union organizing. And so it's like, what is the natural steps for us to take so that we can not necessarily have a seat at the table, but what tables do we have to create for ourselves? Because sometimes we don't need to be at that table. You know, that table is not meant for us. It was never meant for us. We can claw our ways in, but it was not meant for us. And so what does it mean for us to actually, you know, analyze the landscape, identify the women early, because that's one of the things that we don't do very well as a community. Political parties, certain ones do it better than others, where they identify the bench and they find the people who are like worth cultivating and really like investing in, to be able to say, I can see what your trajectory is going to be, and I'm willing to show up and support you. And so I can say in Florida, we don't really have that space. But nationally, there are many spaces that are being created where it's like, we have the Black Campaign School, we have all of these different tools that are willing to support people and kind of integrate them into how do you run for office and the things that you're going to need, again, to kind of do that inventory, really, and that self-inventory of what does it mean to actually run for office? What are the things that you have to consider? What are the things that you're sacrificing? But all in all, because I'll cut it short because I'm definitely interested in the conversation, is that we know our Black women show up, and they show up time and time again. I know I had said this on a panel after the election, and some people kind of not necessarily took offense to it, but I was like, Black women save America. Like, that's whether people want to acknowledge it or not, we save America from itself. And this past election showed that once again, that we are the ones that have to save America from itself. Because should we choose to take a step back and not care anymore, we would be on a completely different path. as a country. And everyone knows this, whether or not they choose to acknowledge it, we would be on a very completely different path. Even in the state of Florida, where again, yes, our state legislature is Republican controlled from the executive to the, to the state legislature. But at the local level, we're starting to see finally this groundswell and this shift where people are willing to enter this space. And so it is now our responsibility as community to really shield our people and protect our people when they decide to put themselves out there, to be able to say, this is how I can support you moving forward. What is the agenda of the community? How can I bring the community into this space with you so you are not standing here alone? Because this is how we have to show up for you, because you are our representative, but this is not your job to do alone. And that's part of us being able to break out of our mentality of politicians being our saviors. And that's a huge, huge conversation that we have to continue having, particularly within the Black community. Of our elected officials are not our saviors. They are a servant. And so we have to be very clear of what we are asking of them, because we can't hold them accountable when we don't have an agenda to hold them accountable to.
Yeah. Well said. I could listen to you go on, you and Paul. One thing I will kind of echo and maybe pivot a little bit is when you talk about Black women saving America, and it reminds me of a continuing theme as a part of these conversations from the first Black women that we can identify who were in this land that we now know as Florida, is that we've had to do that in defense of ourselves. It's not about saving America from itself, is that it's a protective type of behavior in terms of the way we show up. And I also see this kinship between what you're telling us today about the way that Black women show up and what Paul writes about. The next sentence or two out of that quote that I read in Emancipation Portrayed talked about the fact that when the voter registration effort in 1920, Black women were disproportionately represented. Out of all of the women who were registered to vote in Florida, they were 40% at that point in time. And so there is this really long trajectory of Black women showing up. And I'm glad to hear what you've reported out for us on this kind of new wave at the local level of Black women stepping into the foray. I think we need to see more of that. I think that a lot of this was spurred perhaps first by the victory of Barack Obama, but now that we've had Vice President Kamala Harris come through, I think that also is going to inspire quite a bit of activity. And I just want to demystify, Francesca used the word drag several times in her speech. You probably picked up out of context that's not a good thing. It's when people talk badly about you is when you're getting dragged. So that's your extra little learning nugget for tonight. I wanted to talk to the two of you about that, because one of the things that was interesting to me, number one, about Kamala Harris is the way that we kind of tugged at her identity, right? We've already saw that with Barack Obama. She's the first Black woman. Well, no, she's not just Black, she's Jamaican, she's Southeast Asian. And then when she came to South Florida, right, a battleground region and a battleground state, she visited Florida Memorial University. We were very proud to host her. The next news story, one of the predominant headlines, was that she went to Florida Memorial, which I guess we check the box as Black, even though we're very diverse. She went to sit with the Venezuelan community, but what about the Black Haitian community, right? That was kind of a big bubble, and it was really, it was a good little buzz. It kind of countered the excitement of her coming down. And I know, Sharon, that you've studied this historically. I know, Francesca, you represent this community. Where are we in kind of this relationship between domestically born people of African descent and our Black immigrant community in terms of the collaboration, the potential for collaboration for us to have more of the pie when it comes to elections and governance?
Francesca, I don't mind letting you go first, but I can just quickly say in my book, I looked at that question, what is the relationship among African Americans and then also people of Caribbean descent? and how does that affect them politically? And I found that despite whatever differences they have or whatever stereotypes the groups have about each other, they tend to come together politically. And the overwhelming majority of people of Caribbean descent and African Americans tend to support the same candidate. And especially if there's a Black candidate running, like for example, when President Obama ran in 2008, 2012, the community, there was no split. There was no African American Caribbean split. The majority of people were very much in support of him. But I also found, especially with Haitians in South Florida, that they are more likely to vote for Republicans because in 2016, Donald Trump, it was said, received approximately 20% of the Haitian vote. And then even just recently in 2020, there was a group called Haitian Voices for Trump, and they were very active. And so that's not to say that there aren't African Americans who also are Republicans who supported President Trump, but that's for Black voters, that's a pretty significant number, 20%. But I mean, overall, I found that in various elections, especially when a Black candidate was running, that they tended to focus on their Blackness, and that brought about a sense of solidarity, and they tended to support that Black candidate.
Yeah, and it's just, again, it goes back to a lot of the work that has to be done to like really focus around political education with our communities, because there's just a lot of work that has to be done and a lot of repair, I would say, especially as growing up in the 90s and knowing what that dynamic was between African Americans and Haitians in our communities. I wasn't allowed to speak Creole because I would get beaten down in school. Like I had to literally hide who I was until middle school, because it was in middle school, all the kind of Haitian kids converged from like Toussaint Louverture and Edison Park and all these other schools. And we all kind of came together where we were like, we're enough of a majority where we can actually preserve our identity while we're in school. And so, but what I think is that the millennial generation, so like my generation, we've basically learned because of all that happened, and our elders not willing to kind of come to terms with that history, that they created this division. We're not willing to perpetuate that division. And so we're willing to create spaces where we bring in our Haitians, our Dominicans, our Jamaicans, our Bahamians, and really be able to talk about what does it mean to be Black in America? What does it mean politically? What does it mean economically? What does it mean for the future of our children and our children's children, to really be able to have some very difficult conversations while acknowledging what happened in the past, because we can't just completely dismiss it or ignore that it happened. But it's like, let's have this conversation of divide and conquer, and how we haven't been necessarily the ones that created this division. There's a group of people that benefit from us being divided in this way. And so we have to be able to figure out how to come together. And so, and for the other, I would say, kind of Caribbean Haitian voters who, go a particular way on the spectrum, it's very rooted in faith. And so, because I know, like, I remember having those conversations with Haitian voters in 2016 who were like, I'm voting for Trump, or I'm voting for DeSantis. And I literally would be like, why? And they're like, because I don't like homosexuals. And I'm just like, but what does that homosexuality have to do with the fact that you have to work 3 jobs to pay your rent, to pay your bills, to take care of your children? And I was like, so do you understand what party is trying to do what? And so when you actually would sit down and educate them, some of them, if they hadn't voted yet, they're like, okay, I'm voting for Gillum and I'm voting, this way. And so it's just very important, like the conversations that we have, to really be able to kind of dig a little bit deeper in people's understandings of why they're doing what they're doing, because a lot of them are just kind of going with the flow of what they see a majority people around them doing. And again, you're kind of following a bunch of uninformed people making very uninformed decisions that's going to have a drastic impact on their communities.
Yeah, well, you'd be pleased to know that my middle school age son attended a summer camp down in Miami Shores and came home and insisted that I needed to find a Haitian relative. That, are you sure we're not Haitian? Because the predominant culture in middle school, to be down, he needed to be Haitian. And I grew up in a different region of Florida, but still experienced some of the prejudice and bias at a different time. I was really, I was amused, but I was really quite glad to see the sea change that represented. And so yeah, there's work to do, and there's way too much at stake, especially here in South Florida. But I want to bring it back to something else you said, Francesca, that reminded me of something Paul lifted up when he was giving these examples of how they were able to go out in these previous generations and advocate for the right to vote. And that was mutual aid. You called it ecosystem. He called it mutual aid. And so it just seemed to me that there is this marriage and this bridge, and there, as always, are lessons that we can learn from the past. And I know, Paul, you're not only a brilliant historian, but you're an activist in your own right. I wonder, as we move towards wrapping up, and I still will reissue the call to our audience. If there are any questions you would like to pose, please do that. But as in listening and reflecting on the conversation tonight, aside from kind of the mutual aid piece of it, what lessons do you think we can bring forward, especially as we look to continue this really expansive legacy of Black women's political involvement in the state of Florida? What lessons can we point to and that could encourage us as we continue today?
I think learning from Black women's leadership is the most important lesson that I can think of. When I think of people like Angela Davis, Elizabeth Catlett, Amy Garvey, Hattie Caney, in the 90s, when I was a younger labor organizer, the most important labor union leader in the United States of America was a woman by the name of Hattie Caney. She was an African-American woman who had migrated from Alabama. She moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. She led the Frontier hotel strike, which was a historic breakthrough for labor in Las Vegas. Las Vegas is a union town because of it now. And she rose to become the president of a union of 60,000 members from 84 different nations on the planet, one of the most diverse unions anywhere in the world. And when you think of Angela Davis, the way that she promotes ideals of internationalism, because that's one of the things that we're talking about tonight, is that African-American women and their leadership have rejected the narrow politics of American nationalism, which is, after all, white nationalism, right? I see my sister organizer, Ronnie Bennett, with South Florida People of Color. That's an organization which has rejected these narrow nationalistic politics. If we're going to talk about inclusivity, let's talk about Ella Baker. Let's talk about the political style of organizing that she taught younger SNCC organizers in the 1960s. And so, the whatever we call it, but these ideas of mutual aid, of helping each other out, of realizing my struggle is your struggle, right? And regardless of where we are temporally or spatially, but I think learning from African-American women's leadership is so absolutely vital. As Francesca said, what happened in Georgia, unless you knew the story, you would think it was a miracle. Georgia, are you kidding me, right? But if you know about Black women's leadership, then suddenly the miracle becomes something you can study and learn from. I just hope we continue to learn from what people like Francesca are doing, what Ronnie Bennett's doing with South Florida People of Color, what you're doing, Tamika, what you're doing, Sharon. We've got to learn that now is the time to open our eyes and open our ears.
Thank you for that, Paul. And I echo, I tell you, I don't try not to get too emotional, and I definitely don't get excited about a whole lot. But I have to say, I've been kind of fangirling about this last electoral cycle with Kamala Harris, who we've mentioned. You mentioned Georgia. And what I continue to learn about the decade-long struggle there to flip that red state blue. I am so inspired by the Black women who have been a big part of that. When you look at Latasha Brown and Black Voters Matter, when we talk about the mayoral leadership of Keisha Lance Bottoms, when we talk about Stacey Abrams, both of the last names I called are graduates of historically Black colleges and universities, which is another entire layer that we need to bring into this mix. When we talk about Ufot Nsé and what she's been doing, Nsé Ufot, excuse me, I mispronounced her name. I think that there are stellar examples. And I think what I see is that finally on the national stage, we're getting a chance to shine, but it really is just the pinnacle of a pyramid. This is built on centuries of struggles and lessons and work. And I think that the best is yet to come. When I hear somebody like Francesca, who's out there and who's working and encouraging people to run and organizing, when I hear about Sharon's research and the writing that she's doing, the work that you do, Paul, I remain excited about what the possibilities hold, because we've got real work to do to build a society that I think we perhaps agree ought to be with the most opportunity for everyone. And part of the way that we know we are moving in the right direction is if Black women are winning as a part of that. So I want to thank you all for the work that you each do, and more importantly, for being willing to give of your time this evening. With that, Keith, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I don't know if any comments or questions have appeared, but if not, either way, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
I don't see that any questions had appeared, so we're just going to go ahead and conclude for this evening. But thank you so much to all of our panelists for participating tonight. We really appreciate you being here. And thank you for all of our members of our audience who participated as well. We really appreciate you joining us for this evening's program. For those that missed any of the prior programs, again, we do have those recordings available on our website by going to floridahumanities.org. We also encourage you to check out our website to see some of the other upcoming events, things in our archive. Check out Forum Magazine. There's lots of content in store for you if you want to learn more about these topics or other topics that are related to our state. So again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at another program soon.
Somebody's hand is up, I think.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to add them in.
Okay. They'd have to type in the chat.
Yeah, Dr. Nelson, we can entertain a question if you'd like, but you'd have to type it into either the chat or the Q&A if you can.
And while she's doing that, I just quickly want to say thank you to you also, Keith, and also to you, Tamika, for the work that you do and the research that you do, because you've been bragging about us, but you've not said very much about yourself at the work that you do as an administrator, because there are not a lot of African-American female administrators. So thank you for all that you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Let's see. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think this might be one of my last hurrahs trying to wear both of these hats between Black History Month and Women's History Month. I'm gonna just stick with the administration for now. They win. All right, we may not be able to get Dr. Nelson. It doesn't look like she's got it, but we tried. Thank you, Francesca, for pointing that out. Oh, I see. Let's say Q&A. She just typed that. Hello?
Like I did. Oh, I think she was responding. She did have a question, but we need her to type the question. Oh, she's like, okay. How do we create spaces for Black women to get the visibility needed to succeed in these spaces?
Yeah, who wants to tackle that question? How do they get the visibility they need to succeed? I'm reminded of what you offered, Fran, with the example of the groups that are coming together. You said not so much in Florida, but nationally, to help build platforms for women. Could you talk maybe a little bit more about what you see?
I would definitely say there's, again, like you have the Black Campaign School, the Collective PAC, where they're basically, again, creating a lot of tools to really kind of walk you from like A to Z around what it means to run for office and what you need to run for office, from like your campaign plan, your finance plan, all of those different things. So I definitely recommend the Black Campaign School as a tool, particularly for Black women. And I know that they're actually trying to work on like a very specific module and curriculum for Black women because of all that came out of 2020. I would also say the visibility, honestly, is like, I know it's sometimes like a time crunch, but it's really just being able to be in certain spaces, whether that's being appointed to a commission or being appointed to an advisory board, because that's where you're going to be able, again, to expand the universe and the people that you're going to come in contact with that are going to be very important to when you run. And so I know it's usually very difficult depending on circumstances, but that's a very important place to be. And you'd be surprised how many local governments, county commission, city commission, village councils that have empty seats for like the Commission for Women, for the Black Affairs Advisory Board. All of these different places are very strategic when you're thinking about like, how do you need to expose yourself?
Any other thoughts, Sharon?
Well,
Or
I would just say that as far as Black women getting visibility to succeed, Sharice is a good friend of mine, and she's a gifted educator and scholar at Southern University. And I think that it's very important for us as professors, and even if you're not a professor, if you're an activist, to mentor young women. Because one thing that impresses me on our campus and so many others, I see so many young students engaging in the kind of activism that we never would have done. When I was a student, we went to class and we went home and that was it. And they question things and they challenge things. And as a result, whenever they see any type of injustice, they speak out. And it's important that we encourage students to do that. I even remember seeing footage of Stacey Abrams when she was a student at Spelman. And even then you could see that there was something really special about her, even same with Kamala Harris. And so it's important for us to mentor young students, male and female, and to let them know that there's nothing wrong with being outspoken and for questioning injustice. So I would say that.
I mean, all I would add to that would be, read Sharon Austin. My gosh. I mean, these incredible works that Professor Austin has written, Race, Power, and Political Emergence in Memphis. She talked to us about her most recent work. I think we need to really lift up the work of African-American women scholars and really understand that they face obstacles in the academy that their male counterparts have little understanding of. And the last thing I would mention is just encourage people to do what Professor Austin has done, and which is to become an outstanding writer. Encourage our organizers to write, because if we don't write our stories, we know what's going to happen. Other people are going to write them for us. So I love, now I'm going to sound like an old school history prof, right? But I'm like, I tell my students, writing is to the 21st century what public speaking was to the 20th. Now that's not completely true, but the point out that I'm trying to make is what I learned as a younger organizer, which is you've got to have those writing skills. And I think now it's more important than ever. Remember when we used to say, Sharon, you got to learn how to write concisely? That was before Twitter even, right? Now you really have to write concisely. So writing is so critical, I think. I just have to get it off that my professor and organizer's heart.
I echo that. I see it every day. And while I held up Sharon's book, this is a fantastic book. I do want to let you know, Paul, I have your book too. I'm allergic. Fun fact, I hate dust covers, so I take them off as much as I can, but I do have your book here. So anyway, that was our question. So thank you for that, Dr. Austin. That was a really important one. And yeah, I hope that I will also say, for those of us in the university spaces, with the Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial, I'm hoping that we can build bridges and platforms for folks like Francesca in the community to uplift them and elevate the work that they're already doing, elevate the conversations, but also to help train the future generations of students. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there that I've seen, and I'm excited about the potential to bring more of that to Florida Memorial. So that's another way to make it all happen. But I think we're done. Keith?
All right, fantastic. Again, thank you so much for everyone that joined us, and we look forward to seeing you at another program soon.
Absolutely. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.